Real danger may not come from a physical attack on a facility, but through cyber attacks on the connected sites by hackers thousands of miles away.
Now, hundreds of thousands of British Airways passengers have had their bank details stolen in one of the biggest data breaches to hit a UK company.
It's called a ransomware attack, and the FBI says they're on the rise everywhere.
Hackers this time going after schools, actually breaking into school data systems, and all for a profit.
Hackers have stolen up to $1 billion from financial institutions in over 30 countries in what could be the biggest bank heist in history.
Officials now believe hackers targeted at least a half dozen government agencies, including the Department of Energy that oversees our nuclear weapons stockpile.
Cyber attack against the city. We're learning by officials that the city's email accounts and server functions were targeted.
Now, some foreign entities are allegedly carrying out cyber attacks on an unprecedented scale.
America under virtual invasion. Hackers targeting the COVID vaccine rollout with new cyber attacks.
If you're a small business, even just a mom and pop operation, a cyber attack can threaten everything that you have.
Hello everybody, I'm Danny Jenkins, CEO of ThreatLocker. I want to talk to you about how Zero Trust is shaping the future of cybersecurity and what this means for you as an MSP. The most likely way you're going to go out of business in 2021 is not COVID, it's not your office building down if you're still in an office, it's a cyber breach. A cyber breach is the most likely way and the biggest reason companies, and specifically MSPs, are going out of business. Back in 2000s, 1990s, viruses were really not that bad. I mean, I remember getting a piece of malware that infected every computer in the organization. No one talked about, oh, the business is ending, we're in trouble, what are we going to do? It was a nuisance. We had to clean the computers up. We had to scrub them, maybe in the worst case, rebuild them. But they weren't business-failing malware. And then as the years progressed, malware got worse and worse and worse. And it wasn't just targeting big companies, but small companies, dental offices, MSPs. I remember working on a case with Emotet. I don't know if anyone here has ever dealt with a case of Emotet. It kind of reminds me of this scene at the end of the movie, The Terminator, where the Terminator is trying to kill Sarah Connor, and Kyle Reese takes a piece of dynamite and shoves it in the Terminator's stomach and blows him to pieces. And then he just gets back up and carries on. That's kind of like Emotet. It just doesn't die. And if you've ever had an infection, you'll know what I mean. It spreads from computer to computer. It's polymeric. The hash is changing every single time it transitions. And it embeds itself in the Windows files. So it's very, very hard. It switches out common Windows files to itself for you to find it and detect it. And what's worse about it is not only is it taking your computers down, slowing down your network, it's stealing your data, it's stealing your bank account credentials, and it's ultimately responsible for hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars of financial theft. Ransomware. Everyone here, I'm sure, has dealt with ransomware at least one point. It started off as somebody downloading a file, it encrypting, and they used to ask for $500, $300. We've encrypted your photos, and somebody would download this virus, it would encrypt their files, and then they could pay the $300, and then they'd either get their data back or they wouldn't. And it wasn't targeting your business. It was very, you're a stupid user, stupid consequences happen. As long as you've got a backup, then you're okay. Then we evolved to ransomware 2, where the attackers spent a little bit more time. They realized, okay, I can go after big enterprises, and big enterprises, and my background is enterprise, are often attacked. They're used to being attacked. We know, as an enterprise security professional, people are trying to get into our business. Bank of America know that if someone can get into our system, they can steal millions or hundreds of millions of dollars from us by getting into our network. So they take offensive methods, they take defensive methods to stop that from happening. Now, as a small business, you never really had to worry about. The amount of times I've heard this, and up until recently, or the last few years at least, it was mostly true, where a small business, a manufacturing company, would say, who cares about my data? Who cares about my files? No one wants my data. I don't have anything that important. Now, over the last few years, the targets have shifted. Everyone realized, why do I want to go after an enterprise? They've got money that they're using to defend themselves. But if I go after a small business, if I go after a dental office or a car dealership, well, they have money too, but they're not spending it on security because they don't think they're a target. So I can encrypt all their files. I can encrypt their backups. I can spend 2 or 3 days, and I can make $700,000 in a week. I can't make that. I don't know about anyone else here. So these attackers shifted their focus from large enterprise to small businesses and MSPs. Of course, MSPs are kind of like a golden ticket, because if you can get into an MSP, you can get into all of their clients. And if you can get into one of their clients, quite often you can get into the MSP. There are 2 ways as an MSP you get in the crosshairs of an attacker. One is you're just unlucky. Something bad happens, they come across you on the internet, and one day they decide to go after you. And what they'll do is they'll start calling your clients, pretending to be you. They'll email your clients from spoofed email addresses. I saw one case, and here's a little tip for everyone, where they registered a domain that was nearly exactly the same as the MSP's domain. The only difference was they switched the letter I out, or the letter L out, sorry, to an I, and then capitalized it. In Outlook, in G Suite, in Office 365, you cannot tell the difference between a capital I and a lowercase l. So if you were to register Threat Locker with an I instead of an L, which you can't do because we've already registered, set up an SPF record, a DMARC address, and email someone in my company from that address, even if they looked at it and analyzed it, they wouldn't be able to see that it wasn't coming from an internal domain. So one MSP I saw, someone literally registered their domain, set up all the spoofing technologies, and then emailed their clients pretending to be them and asked them to install GoToAssist or TeamViewer on their machine so they could do urgent system updates. And the customer didn't think twice. I engaged in a conversation. The email address is valid. Why would I care? So on that, if you have the letter L in your domain name, go and register it with an I instead, and make sure you set up the DMARC and the SPF so nobody can spoof that domain. If you are unlucky, and as an MSP, you get in someone's crosshairs, they're going to come after your clients, and you need to be ready to defend them. But there's another way as well that you're going to get in their crosshairs. One is they're going to get onto one of your clients. And once they get onto your clients, they're going to know who their MSP is. They're going to know how much they pay their MSP, what security tools their MSP uses, and everything about them. So if one of your clients gets infected with malware or ransomware, or maybe you don't even know they've been breached, they're going to collect all that data, and then they're going to find out what your RMM is, what the IP address of your RMM is, and all of this data, and then come after you and other of your clients, because it's much easier. Now they've got a playbook of every security tool you use to go after other clients of yours. Part of my background is doing white hat hacking, penetration testing, showing people how I can get into their network. And I want to give you an example of a way that I could get into someone's network and how other attackers do often. Typically, as an attacker, it's easier to go after the user. If somebody can go after vulnerabilities in your software, unpatched servers, that means as an MSP, you failed your job. So what they're going to do, most attackers, is go after one of your users, and they're going to send them an email, send them a Teams message, send them a Facebook message, whatever it may be, a Zoom meeting, and they're going to get them to open something. Now, typically a successful attack, a good attack, isn't going to launch their attack right there. What they're going to do is they're going to open up a remote shell on that user's computer. So the piece of malware they run, whether it comes from a Word document or somebody downloaded an exe, it's going to give them a remote shell on their machine. And quite often the user, if done properly, doesn't even know this is happening. From that remote shell, they're going to move around that customer's network. So they might replace network files on a network share with other executables that have document icons on them. They might collect data from the network, collect the RMM, and things like that. And they're going to move laterally in the environment. Now, at some point, they're going to launch an attack, and sometimes that will happen 30 minutes later. Sometimes they'll wait 2 weeks. They're also going to catalog what the RMM is, what the IP address of the RMM is, and then they're going to go after that RMM for vulnerabilities, because now they've got at least some kind of connection key to connect to the RMM, so they know a computer that they can connect to. When the MSP connects to their machine, and I did this as an example recently, they're going to use the connection between you and your client to try and infect your machine. And I want to talk about a way I did this recently as a demonstration for a friend of mine in the UK. I asked him to connect to my machine using his remote access tool. And I told him I had a problem with my machine. I intentionally left a whole load of Windows updates. So he kicked off a bunch of updates on my machine and minimized his remote session. Now, while he was connected to my machine, I had malware running on my machine, intentional malware that I'd created for the purpose of a demonstration. And he was using his computer in the background while minimizing TeamViewer or Screen Connect or whatever tool you were running. And while it was minimized, his clipboard was shared with my clipboard. So I was able to see him logging into his RMM by copying his password from his password manager. I was able to see that he was working on PowerShell scripts for Office 365. So what I did, and this is quite often what attackers will do, is I harvest everything from his clipboard while he was connected to my machine, and then I started replacing his clipboard. So when he copied a PowerShell script, I replaced it with a different PowerShell script. So he copied his Office 365 script, pasted it into PowerShell. It got replaced with a script that downloaded a piece of malware and gave me remote access to his machine. Now, in this case, this was just for demonstration purposes, but I've seen this multiple times. So as an MSP, when one of your clients gets infected, you're now at increased exposure because you regularly communicate with that client, connect to their machines, and you share things with them. And even though in many cases those tools are designed to not allow transmission upstream, it happens anyway. Something as simple as clipboard sharing can allow you to be compromised, can allow malware to run on your machines just because your client got malware. Now, we have this new trend of ransomware as well, and we often think about ransomware as it encrypts our files, backups. If we got good backups, we can always recover from ransomware. And you should have good backups. You should have off-site backups, and it is very much your last line of defense. But the newer types of ransomware, they're going a step further. First thing is they're collecting data so they can launch later attacks, not just against you, but against all of your business partners. Because as someone who's been on the red team, trying to get into a company requires you know knowledge about that company, who their relationships are with. And if I know that this guy sends you an invoice every month with this amount, I'm more likely to be successful if I spoof that data. So the ransomware 3.0 is collecting all that data so they can use it for later attacks against their business partners and them again in the future. The other thing it's doing is uploading the data to the internet. And this leaves companies in a really difficult situation because they've got a backup, they've restored, but this guy is claiming to dump all of their data on the internet unless they pay the ransom. Of course, you don't really know if you pay the ransom if are they going to dump the data anyway? You can't trust a criminal, so quite often, well, all the time, it's not a good idea to pay them. But it leaves that customer in this really dangerous situation that they have to tell their clients now that their data has been compromised. Once data is published on the internet, you can't get that data back. You can restore from a backup if somebody encrypts your files, if you've got good backups. You can bring systems, rebuild computers and servers and do all of this. But your data being published out there, there's no getting that back. You can't recover it. You can't guarantee that it's gone. It's there. It's out forever. And maybe they'll dump it on the internet. Maybe they won't. Maybe they'll share it. Maybe they won't. Maybe they'll use it on future attacks. But you don't know that. But what you do know is there's no sure way to get that data back. Now, I want to ask everybody a question here and just think about this. Or do you need to be a local administrator to install software? The answer is no. And I ask this a lot, and it surprises me how many people think the answer is yes. Local administrative permissions do not stop you, or lack thereof of local administrative permissions, do not stop you from installing software. Dropbox, Google Chrome can all be installed without local administrative permissions. And guess what else can be installed? Malware, ransomware, games. There's lots of things that can run without local administrative permissions. The only thing that a local administrator permissions will protect you from is someone modifying key components of the operating system, your Windows folder, your program files folder. These are protected if you're not a local administrator. And by no means am I endorsing that you should run as a local administrator, because you shouldn't. But quite often people have this illusion that by not being a local administrator, you're secure. Now, will your threat detection detect all threats that are going to come in? Of course, the answer is no. If someone exploits your RMM and pushes out software, are you confident that your EDR is going to detect it? And are you confident that software that you've deployed is never going to be exploited? The answer should be no, because there's no way in the world, if you think about how threat detection works, it looks for bad things based on previous patterns. If it worked 100% of the time, there would be no conversation to be had. I wouldn't be standing here today talking about ransomware, talking about threats. Malware is getting harder and harder to detect. And over the last decade, we've seen antivirus, next generation antivirus, artificial intelligence antivirus, threat hunting, SOCs, EDR. And while these are important tools in the fight against security, they are all ways and different ways to detect threats. Unfortunately, the reality is you can't detect every threat. Having multiple layers of threat detection is basically having multiple house alarms, burglar alarms in your house. You may have glass broken sensors, you may have motion sensors, you may have contact sensors. If there's not a lock on the front door, someone can still walk in and steal your TV. And even if these tools, even if we could, our antivirus or an EDR was going to magically stop every single threat and detect every piece of malware, more and more often, attackers are using legitimate tools. We saw the water company in Florida get compromised using TeamViewer, where somebody connected using TeamViewer to a machine and effectively poisoned the water. Yes, it was stopped before it caused too much damage. I'm not sure what I'm more concerned about here. Is it the water company having TeamViewer installed on that machine, or is it the one person sitting on that machine could have poisoned the water to begin with? Maybe there's some other controls that we want to think about there as well. But even if we could stop all malware, TeamViewer isn't malware. GoToAssist isn't malware. These are legitimate tools that are used for legitimate purposes. And then we've got tools like PowerShell, RunDLL, RegServe. These are tools that can run fileless malware. You can live off the land, you can run scripts, you can run commands without even putting malware on your machine. All of these tools are often weaponized and used against us. An example of this might be you get a Word document that opens up PowerShell and turns on BitLocker or uploads your files to the internet. I've done that 50 times. I've run a PowerShell command, never had it detect an EDR, copied all of the files up to a Google Cloud Drive. Now, there's a lot of scary stuff going on here, but the reality is we've got to think about how can we defend against these attacks and what can we do to stop them. First of all, stop chasing the threat. We can't detect every single threat. We can't detect every single piece of malware. But what we can do is build effective security controls around them. When we think about security, we should think about it as a triangle. Every element of security, and in this point we're talking about endpoints, can be stopped. Every threat can be stopped in one of three ways. One is the human way. If a user doesn't open an email with a piece of malware in, if they don't download something, the threat is foiled. The other way is we can detect it. We can use an antivirus and EDR threat hunting and try and detect it either pre-breach or post-breach before it causes any damage. Now, as an IT professional, you have no control over either of those. You can't control if the user opens email. You can beat them, you can threaten them, you can try and scare them, you can try and train them. But the reality is, if Janice on the front desk clicks on it, it's outside of your control. You can't control if your antivirus is going to detect it, or your threat hunting, or your EDR. What you can control is what software can run on your machines. If you can block everything by default out of the box, if you can say nothing runs unless it's approved, that puts you in control. Now, I'm not suggesting you don't train your users, because of course you should. I'm not suggesting you don't have detection. But if you want to be effective against stopping malware or other software that you don't need, TeamViewer, games, but deny by default. Now, it might sound scary, And it might sound difficult. Well, denying by default is really complicated. But the reality is it's not. You deploy an agent on the endpoints, on your servers. It learns what your environment looks like. It catalogs what applications need to run, how files talk to each other, what programs need to talk to what files. After a learning period, you turn it on to deny by default. You can review what it's learned. So if it's learned something that shouldn't have happened, if somebody played a game and it's learned that game, you can remove that policy. But after that learning period, essentially, you can deny by default. The next thing you want to do is ring fence those applications. So if Office needs to run, these are out-of-the-box policies with ThreatLocker, you can just turn them on. If it needs to run but doesn't need to talk to PowerShell, don't let it. If PowerShell doesn't need unrestricted access to your file shares, don't let it. If users don't need to access your backup share or Office doesn't need to access your backup share, don't let it. Ring fence applications to keep them in their lane and make sure they're not doing more than they should do. And then control access to your storage devices as well. Put storage policies in place. If you need USB drives, great. Allow them to be used. But if they don't, lock them down. If you need one USB drive, allow that to be used. With ThreatLocker, we're going to give you all of these controls, and we're going to make it really, really easy. You can deploy ThreatLocker and lock it down in a couple of hours across all of your clients, probably 5-10 hours for a 2,000 user MSP of investment on your part. And you're going to be in control, and you're going to be using zero trust. You're going to be using controls to lock down your environment. Not only are we going to lock down and secure your environment, but we're going to give you a granular audit of everything. Every file, every application that's opened. In addition to that, we can do things like elevation control. Of course, we want to take away administrative rights, but maybe QuickBooks update needs to run, or this user needs to install a new piece of software that you've approved. You can give them elevation control temporarily or permanently for certain applications, so they don't have to be local administrators. And the approval process is really easy. It's 60 seconds, pop up, request, ticket, approve. 60 seconds later, they can open it. If you do these things, if you implement controls, if you implement zero trust, default deny, ring fencing in your environment, you're going to stop known and unknown malware. You're going to stop shadow IT. You're going to stop the weaponization of good tools as well. People using good tools against you, but also people weaponizing PowerShell. And you're going to be able to control administrative permissions. And all that's required from you is time, and not a lot of time, hours per thousands of seats, not days or months, to deploy, monitor, lock down, and configure. I appreciate your time, everybody. If you want to find out more about ThreatLocker, please book a demo at www.threatlocker.com. Thank you very much.